Right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for joining us this evening for our webinar, A Brief History of Medicine in Early 19th Century New England. My name is Brittany Garrett, and I am the Collections and Research Public Programming Specialist here at Old Sturbridge Village. And tonight, we will be examining what medical care was like in the early 19th century before any knowledge of germs or any government regulations. And to guide us through this, we'll be joined by historian and curator of mechanical arts, Tom Kelleher. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Brittany.
So before we begin, I would like to share a short land acknowledgement. Old Sturbridge Village is located on the traditional land of the Nipmuc peoples. New England and the rest of the United States consists of land expropriated from Native American peoples. We honor the land and the indigenous peoples who have stored it toward the generations and continued to store it today. And just a couple of reminders before we begin. This program is being recorded and it will be posted on the Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page. There will also be a question and answer session following our discussion tonight. So I invite all of our live viewers to submit questions at any point during the presentation in the Q&A feature at the bottom center of your screen. And now, without any further ado, I will pass things over to Tom.
Thanks, Brittany. And thank you all for coming along for this. By the early 1800s, for a long time, not much had changed about medicine. There were the faces changed, but the basic treatments had not changed. This picture on the left, by the way, is Hippocrates of Kos, the father of medicine, and he's in the temple of Asclepius, which was one of the Greek gods of healing, which is why these temple priests have non-venomous rat snakes around, the symbol of Asclepius. And you can see on the left here the staff of Asclepius with the pole with the snake wrapped around it, which is the real symbol of medicine. There's Asclepius in all his glory. But the single snake around the single staff, like the Star of Healing here and the World Health Organization flag, is the proper symbol of the medical profession. The caduceus, the staff of Hermes in Rome, the god Mercury, same guy, depending where he's a Greek or Roman, he carried the caduceus, as you can see on the bottom, the messenger god. An army officer in 1902, a U.S. Army officer, decided they should have this symbol as the medical corps of the U.S. Army. And so that's why the medical corps today still wears the caduceus, although it has nothing to do with medicine. Whether it was a captain or a colonel who gets the blame, it's still up to debate. But that's a little sidelight. But always have the single stick and the single snake, not the two with the wings, because that's Mercury. Anyway, in the time before the late 19th century, it was a pre-scientific world. Yeah, there's the Renaissance and, early scientific investigation, discovery, but especially as far as medicine goes, it's very much a pre-scientific world, despite efforts by people like Hippocrates. And there's really, for most people then, and an awful lot of people today, there's not an absolute clear boundary between the spiritual and the physical worlds. And so prayer and medicine went hand in hand. In fact, in colonial America, a lot of times it was ministers who were also many of the healers and physicians. Anyway, I'm throwing a few cartoons here from David Claypool Johnson, who published a humor magazine out of Boston. I call it the Mad Magazine of the 1830s. He called it Scraps, but we don't have to go into the thing, except he has these cartoons about medicine and healing. This one is a doctor who's a Dr. Truth Faith, who is disparaging the woman for wanting to call in probably a better doctor who is not of their religious denomination. Anyhow, but even today, when we or someone we love is seriously ill, oftentimes, despite our perhaps faith in the medical profession, we often exert other faith. I'm not making commentary, one positive or negative about that. I think it's part of at least a large part of human nature. So the little connections between then and now. But in the world of medicine before, or the world in general, before the late 1800s, really, there were all sorts of theories about disease and theories about how the body worked, but nobody really understood what was going on a biological, on a chemical, much less a minute physiological level. I mean, it's even in the relatively the past few centuries that they even figured out how circulation works with Harvey's discoveries about how the heart circulates. Most of the history of humankind, it's been very different. There was a big fad, excuse the picture on the left, there's a big fad in the later 19th, early 20th century of medical students posing with their cadaver that they get to dissect to learn about how the body is put together by taking it apart. I once worked with a guy who was a former United States Marine. He was a professional engineer. He always said most engineers go to college to train how to build things. I went to the Marine Corps to learn how to take things apart, but we both understand the same things. Anyway, that's how they learned medicine, was by dissecting bodies, as medical students still do. I don't know if they still take pictures, probably not, because of social media, heaven knows. Anyway, but there was no real scientific basis behind medical treatments as a result. Today, if you're any kind of a respectable and certainly a licensed medical practitioner, you're going to have scientific basis, double-blind studies and such behind what you do. But then oftentimes you would do something because people wanted you to do something if you were a healer. And a lot of times, if the patient recovered, it was more in spite of than because of the treatment. Death, like today, is still inevitable. But then death was something that wasn't unusual. Today, our society tends to deny death. We separate it off. People go to hospitals to die very often. When they are dead, they're buried from a special place, or they're not buried, they're cremated, and we have ceremonies and rituals to deal with that. But in most of the history of humankind, people died at any age. Today, death is something that most of us think of as happens to people after 70, 80, 90 years. And it happens sometimes otherwise, but tragedy. Then you had as much chance of dying as a child as you did as a senior. 1 in 8 children didn't even see their first birthday. And at birth, most Americans could expect to live to be about 45, but there's no guarantee of that. Some people coming to Old Sturbridge Village think everybody died young and you're old by your late 30s. That's not the case. The reality, though, was that a lot of people died young. Queen Victoria's favorite prime minister, Benjamin Disraeli, is credited with saying there's 3 kinds of deceit in the world: lies, damned lies, and statistics. And I think that statistic about life expectancy, which is now, over 80 for Americans, is one of those deceits. So if 2 babies are born, say in 1750, and one doesn't see their first birthday, the other lives to be 90. The age is 45 for an average, but that's a distortion, the statistics. Anyhow, so sickness was something that was not at all unusual, and serious sickness was not unusual. And so it was certainly terrible, but it didn't really surprise anyone. And when people did get seriously ill, people certainly hoped for a cure, hoped for a recovery, but there wasn't that almost innate expectation of it that many of us modern people do. We figure for most things, the doctors can fix it. And oftentimes, thank goodness, they can. And in the early world, of course, there's no health insurance. Just in the 1700s and early 1800s, you're starting to get business insurance, like insuring sea voyages and insuring property. So you get fire insurance and that kind of thing. But health insurance was still very much in the future. No health maintenance organizations, no, the introduction of all kinds of technology into healing. Certainly not the big pharmaceutical giants or the huge industry that healthcare has become today. That certainly was not on their horizon. What people generally practiced, Orthodox medicine, was remedial medicine. It was practical. Again, they had no germ theory, as Brittany mentioned, as I've mentioned. They didn't really understand the detailed physiology or biochemistry of the body in the way that we do today. We even learn in, high school biology, much less college or medical school or other advanced practice. So they didn't really have much understanding of what caused disease. They had all sorts of theories. Some thought it was warmth, since since living bodies are warm and dead bodies are cold, must be something to do with warmth. When they start fooling around with electricity to figure out, well, if they can make dead frog legs jump with electricity must have something to do with life. There's all sorts of ideas of what excites the body, which either wears it out or burns it out. But nobody really understood what was going on, even if they claimed to. So it was more shooting in the dark, if you will. I mentioned earlier that the father of medicine is generally recognized, at least in Western culture, as Hippocrates of Kos, a Greek physician, and his followers. Hippocrates, as you can see here, lived in the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, and he, of course, the famous doctors still today take the Hippocratic Oath. Hippocrates really believed, first off, you didn't do any harm. You weren't going to harm the patient. You were actually going to try to do good. You weren't going to just do something that might hurt them and without good intentions. And not, for your own personal profit or other motivations, which is why doctors will not help in capital punishment today, even when they use intravenous solutions to try to execute people where that goes on. Of course, it doesn't go on here in Massachusetts, but anyway, that's why doctors aren't involved in that. They get medical technicians who don't take the Hippocratic Oath for that reason, to at least insert the intravenous device. Anyway, the point is that Hippocrates really advocated for the professionalization of medicine and reasoned observation. In other words, get a little less intimate with faith and try to look at what's going on and try to put things together, deduce what's going on, reason it out, and try to treat diseases naturally, rather than invoking superstition, invoking the gods. Now, Hippocrates wasn't going to be against the gods because, in ancient culture, it wasn't a matter of personal faith. It was a matter of civic responsibility to respect the gods. And so, the original Hippocratic Oath, would pledge allegiance to Apollo and Asclepius and other of the Greek pantheon. But anyway, another huge figure in early medicine who loomed over Western medicine for the better part of a millennium and a half was another Greek physician who eventually ended up in Rome when Rome was the more center of the Western world, was Galen. And Galen, as you can see, lived in the 2nd century and into the early 3rd century of the Common Era. And Galen didn't come up with the idea of the humoral theory of medicine, that the body was made up and controlled by 4 humors: phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. But he really popularized and I would almost say solidified this humoral theory of medicine, that sickness was caused because you were out of humor, you were in bad humor, ill humor, and the humors needed to be balanced in order to restore health, which is why for so much for the past couple millennia, doctors would do things like bleed patients or get them to vomit, or give them laxatives for purging their bowels, or cause either phlegm or interstitial fluid to come out of the body, and use various physical and medical means chemical means to accomplish those ends of balancing the humors. And we still say things like somebody's in a bad humor, or they've got a phlegmatic personality, or a sanguine personality, or a caloric personality, anyway, with their bile and such. Anyway, the Galen wasn't just some theorist, he did an awful lot of it, actual hands-on anatomical research and experiments. But in ancient Rome, you couldn't experiment on people. He was a physician to the gladiators, and so he saw a lot of bodies opened up, but it was opened up by swords and such like that. So he couldn't really do scientific experiments, but he was a careful observer. He did most of the experimenting on animals, dissecting living and dead animals, and he wrote extensively on his findings. And he really had great respect and unified medical practice as well as theory. But since he had a lot of things wrong, because animals aren't exactly like people, despite the use of animals in medical experiments today, a lot of times animals' bodies aren't exactly the way our bodies work, and aren't a lot of their systems aren't exactly how our bodies work, which is an argument that some people advance against using animals for medical experiments, even apart from the whole humane idea of it. Anyway, but he really advanced that idea, I said, of humoral theory, of balancing the four humors. And his long shadow was hanging over Western medicine into the 20th century. In fact, even into the early 1900s, into the 19 teens, 20s, pharmacists would often get long involved prescriptions to make up called galenics that were basically concoctions that doctors prescribed that ultimately were still aimed at balancing the humors and restoring health. This image on the right of medieval medical dissection is they're teaching from Galen. Notice the big guy in the chair. He's reading Galen. The students are the ones hanging around looking. And then you have basically a butcher who's cutting up the cadaver. It's not a live person. And then you have somebody else who's standing there pointing to things that the person reading the book might be talking about at that moment. And a lot of times Galen, because he looked at animals, identified things that aren't found in the human body, and the person would point to something and say that's what it is. Because Galen had it figured out, so why do research? Galen knows. Anyhow, in the Renaissance, not to get into grand detail, but there were people in this reinvigoration of learning in the 16th and 17th centuries who decided they were going to look at things a little more, and by dissecting human cadavers and drawing very detailed pictures and circulating them, Vesalius and Fabricius and of course William Harvey in England, it added to human knowledge about how the body was made up, and somewhat, at least on a more macro scale, how the body worked. In America, probably the most dominant figure in American medicine for a long time was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, one of the founding fathers, Benjamin Rush. And Rush advocated he was known as the father of heroic medicine. In other words, if a little is good, more is better. Do something dramatic. If a doctor was going to bleed you, the more he bled you, the more impressive it was. And a lot of times people still believe more is better. If one aspirin is good, take three. Even though, yeah, it's a lot of aspirin, but people oftentimes will go for more. And Rush, in a medical sense, was really the greatest advocate of this dramatic or heroic form of practicing medicine. And so, as I said before, illness was rarely a surprise, and most people, when they got sick, were cared for at home. The family was the basic unit of early society, not the individual. Today, I think even though we still come from families, we got to come from somewhere. The individual is the real basic unit of American society. Heaven knows we're an individualistic society today, and more than 1 in 4 of us adults lives alone. Then it was very, very rare to anybody live alone. People lived in family units, and even if one spouse died, very often they'd have to break up housekeeping until they could reconstitute a family unit. If the mother died, if there wasn't a daughter or an unmarried sister or an aunt or a mother who could fill that female head of the household role, the widower, you would usually break up housekeeping, farm the children out to other existing family units until he could remarry and reconstitute his family. But apart from that, because the family was the basic unit of society, when you got sick, you were cared for in the home by members of the household. Hospitals were initially founded not as great medical establishments, but basically as a place for the homeless, the very poor, the destitute, people who really didn't have families who could take care of them, who had a good place to take care of the sick, could be cared for. And that's how hospitals, including Mass General here in Boston, founded in 1811, really got their start. It wasn't so much a place to be cured initially, but a place to die, but at least have somebody to take care of you. And by the 19th century, hospitals are increasingly, especially Mass General, were teaching hospitals. Here's a staged photograph from 1847 of an early demonstration of an anesthesia. If I can make myself go back, yes, you'll notice the ether dome, as it's called, this big dome at Mass General to allow this amphitheater for doing surgical demonstrations. And there were nurses for hire. When Pliny Freeman, whose house we have here at Old Sturbridge Village, when his first wife, Delia Freeman, came down with scrofula, lymphatic tuberculosis, a very nasty disease. And eventually she succumbed to it. When she got bedridden, he basically had one of his daughters and her husband move into the house with their kids so that he'd have help taking care of his wife. And when that got too much, he hired a widow from Boston, Mary Pease, to come and live in their family and help fill the role and take care of Delia Freeman in her final illness. After Julia died, Mrs. Pease went back to Boston. Pliny got lonely and started writing her love letters. And even though she was 14 years older than him, he eventually convinced her to come out and marry him. We luckily have a couple of her letters in our research collection, but that's neither here nor there. But it's an example of nursing there. But there were no professionally trained nurses. It was just someone who'd, gone through life and taken care of ill family members. And if you were widowed, that was a way to get yourself injected into a family and make a living. The person I have in the photograph on the upper right and the woman depicted in the drawing that dominates the screen is the English woman, Florence Nightingale, who organized upper middle class and aristocratic English women to go with the British Army into the Crimean War in the 1850s and take care of the wounded and the ill of the British troops that were fighting there. And she really revolutionized, and she's often seen as the mother of modern nursing, at least here in the English-speaking world. And she advocated the basics of supportive nursing care, which is still a big part of nursing. To basically keep the patient dry and clean and comfortable and rested and fed so the body could recuperate and recover. They knew that keeping the patients well fed and hydrated was important, but when people don't feel well and people have diseases that can cause dehydration, and it's hard to keep food down and food in, and it's not always easy, even today, with all we have, including intravenous access to really always fulfill those bodily needs. But anyway, so most people were treated at home with various and sundry home remedies. A number of years ago on television, there was a advertising campaign for some over-the-counter medicine that advertised Dr. Mom. And that's, who we still look to, is in our own household for cares, for cures, to try to take care of us. Some things that are quite archaic that I don't think anybody does anymore. But when I was a little boy, which granted was in the mid 20th century, in the bygone days of the 1960s, I got earaches, and the doctor gave me, ear drops to cure the infection that was in my ear. But my father, who smoked cigars, would also blow smoke into my ear as a cure. Yeah, I probably didn't help as much as the eardrops that the doctor gave me, but the anesthetic of the tobacco smoke, of the warm smoke, was certainly soothing for me. Um, but it's probably not a prescribed medicine treatment you try now. But anyway, I say that simply because if we all do things, whether it's a hot pack or a cold pack or over-the-counter medicines like aspirin or Tylenol or Advil, or NyQuil or what have you, most of us try to treat illnesses at home if we can. And then as now, there's a lot of information. They didn't have the internet, of course, but there was a lot of remedies people passed mouth to mouth, hand to hand, in letters and in prescriptive literature, books like this one by Lydia Mariah Child, The Family Nurse, just one of many, many, many books. And here's a few of the things from her book, The Family Nurse, that Mrs. Child recommended. Castor oil, which would keep children, well, shall we say, regular. It's a powerful laxative, but some people thought that, because keeping your bowels moving freely was better than being constipated, because nobody feels good when they're constipated. So if you keep kids with a little bit of oil in them, they'll stay regular. And slippery elm or red elm, make a decoction, which is basically taking the bark and brewing it like you'd brew coffee, and drink it. It breaks up mucus, she says, in lung fevers, and it's also good for hemorrhoids and dysentery, which is basically uncontrolled diarrhea, and also consumption. She thinks it's also good for tuberculosis. Again, they don't really know. And it's a healing wash for chilblains and eruptions of the skin. Chilblains are when cold causes inflammation of the fingers and toes, especially in children and the elderly. But anyway, the point is they had a lot of these. It's good for a whole lot of different things, kind of suggestions and treatments. And I always like this one of burning feathers, horn, or leather is good for hysteric fainting fits. Another one is not in hers, but another popular one. I remember this when we used to work in a blacksmith shop, and people, ask you, what do you do for burns? A very popular burn remedy was to boil a live frog in butter and then strain out what was left of the frog and use the butter as a salve. If you do burn yourself, it's better to put cold water or ice on it to reduce the heat and the damage to your tissue, by the way. Putting butter on a burn is not good. It tends to keep in the heat. Anyway, neither here nor there. The ancients didn't know what caused things, so I just don't want you to take their now bad medical advice to heart. Anyway, there are all sorts of common remedies that people used, herbs and oils and roots and all sorts of things that were, purgatives, laxatives, emetics, things to what they called clear blocked menses. We call them chemical abortion today in the 21st century, abortifacients. Things like drinking pennyroyal tea could often, as they would say, clear blocked menses. In other words, if you were pregnant for less than a few months, oftentimes this mild poison would cause a miscarriage. All sorts of tonics which refreshed you when you were feeling not so well. Refrigerants that would cool you down if you had a fever, and all kinds of things to either soothe you or promote perspiration if you need it. They even had a few painkillers, and many things, as I said, were prescribed for a lot of things. Just a few antipyretic herbs. Antipyretic is things that reduce fevers. And of course, our body very often generates heat to fight off infections. They didn't understand that. They just knew that fevers happened and people seemed sick and they didn't feel well. And sometimes they died after that. So then as now, we often give things to reduce fever. Many of us can remember during the initial days of the COVID pandemic, of taking Tylenol or Advil or aspirin to reduce fever. And then they had a whole, these are just some naturally occurring herbs that can be given to try to bring down fevers. And usually these things were prepared in what are called infusions and decoctions. Basically, an infusion is like how you make tea. You put leaves in hot water and let it sit for a little while, then you drink the tea. A decoction is more like traditional coffee. You take something that's harder and grind it up, like bark or roots, or in the case of coffee, the hard beans, and boil them and boil them to boil them to get the goodness out of it, and then strain it and drink the liquid. But that's basically the difference. And then you have what are called tinctures, which are dissolved in alcohol to get the goodness out of it. And then they had what were called patent medicines. They're not patented. People didn't really take out patents on the formula as drug companies do today. But what they used the word patent to mean was it was a proprietary formula. It was secret. They didn't have to list what was on the label. There's no Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And so people didn't have to tell you what was in it. And there were hundreds of these patent medicines, as they were called, that were widely available. I've got an ad here for Phelps Arcanum because it's something that was prepared by a fellow from, well, he was born in Shrewsbury, but he spent most of his life in Worcester. Azer Ronde Phelps, who sold this patent medicine that would cure many, 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 many ills. And you can see the people rejoicing and so happy to have their ills cured by Phelps Arcanum. But a lot of these things are just various herbs, concoctions, chemicals that who knows what was in them and who knows if they worked or how they worked. But a lot of times things were preserved with alcohol and it made you feel better. I don't think there was a big scam to, get people to drink, although they did allow, even in the 19th and 20th century with prohibition of alcohol, there was always an exception for medical use. In fact, during the 1920s, the prohibition that started after World War I and ran until 1933, during that prohibition that gave us gangsters and all the other good stuff of the 1920s, bad stuff, 1920s, early 30s, there was an exception for medical purposes. And so doctors would write prescriptions for medicinal whiskey. And some distilleries stayed in business making medicinal whiskey. And one of them was the Buffalo Trace Distillery down in Kentucky. And it was funny. I went on a tour there once and he said, we don't know what caused whatever they cured with whiskey, but it must have been contagious because if somebody in a family got a prescription, soon they sent everybody in the household to the doctor to get another prescription for a pint of medicinal whiskey. Anyway, in our glass collection, we have the bottles of several of these patent medicines. Again, we don't know what's in them. The bottles have been cleaned. We can't do chemical analysis, but all kind of things. Dr. Jonathan Moore's Essence of Life and the vegetable home syrup. They realized that vegetables were good for you, and so a lot of different vegetable pills and vegetable syrup and tomato pills and all kind of other things were widely used by people hoping to alleviate whatever problems they might have had. Another big popular cure-all of the day that's not at all herbal is calomel. It's mercurous chloride, which is still used today mostly as a fungicide and insecticide. But then they gave it to people to be taken internally as well as topically. Mercury is, of course, very, very poisonous, especially to our nervous systems. And it can cause all sorts of things. The fella on the screen here, he's not being treated with calomel for his deformity. The calomel caused that deformity. It's a very poisonous material, but it was used for treating syphilis. It was used for treating tuberculosis. It was used for treating anything and everything. It was used as a purgative. It was used as a laxative. It was used for all sorts of things. It was one of these, we don't know what's wrong with them. Here, try this. It's strong. Was this barbaric? Was this dangerous? Well, we probably can think, yes, it was. I don't think they didn't know what was causing it. They thought they were doing well. I give the example, thalidomide, which is an anti-neoplastic drug that in the 1950s and 60s was widely prescribed because it seemed to help women with morning sickness. What people didn't realize was that it also caused birth defects. It's an anti-neoplastic. In other words, it inhibits rapidly growing cells like cancer, or like fetuses, which is why a lot of babies didn't survive or were born without arms or legs or with attenuated appendages. It's still around. It's used in cancer treatment. It's not used for morning sickness anymore. But my point is, it's in, recent memory. Um, yeah, people still don't know everything, and people mean well, but we're people. People make mistakes. It just look at the side effects that we hear advertised on television and print and the internet all the time about all kind of prescription and even in some over-the-counter drugs. May cause diarrhea, may cause nausea, may cause heart failure, may cause death, may cause insomnia, asthma attacks in people, all kind of things, liver problems, kidney problems, life-threatening skin reactions, low blood cells, all kind of things. No medicine doesn't have side effects. Some side effects are fairly mild, and it's not saying don't take medicine. I'm just saying, there's no unalloyed good. Everything's a double-edged sword. I'll stop my metaphor festival for now. But another example is what causes cancer. We know today that radiation causes cancer. We know that a lot of powerful chemicals cause cancer. How do we treat cancer? The main things, powerful chemicals and radiation. I'm hoping, not criticizing modern medicine, and because people are trying, and we've made big strides in cancer treatment and cancer cures in the past 50 years. But I'm hoping that in 50 or 100 years, people will look back on the early 21st century and say, what barbarians? Oh my gosh, they are using chemotherapy and radiation to cure cancer when they knew that caused cancer. Who knows what will come of the future? But I'm just saying, we shouldn't judge too harshly people from the past who meant well. Anyhow, let's talk about medicine and doctors. People basically did turn to professional physicians, and doctors were professionals in early America. There are basically three professions: law, divinity, and medicine. So ministers, doctors, and lawyers. And of those, doctors were the most numerous. And back then, you really only called for a doctor when there was a serious illness or serious injury, something that was not just, oh, I've got a cold, oh, I don't feel well, but something, this might kill me, this might, be fatal. That's when you called the doctor. Of course, you couldn't call him on the phone. You really had to send somebody to find the doctor, and he would come to you. Most people didn't have easy transportation. If you were sick enough to need a doctor, you were too sick to find a doctor. So the doctor generally came to you. Some worked out of offices, but many worked out of their homes. And as I said, because of the nature of illness, house calls were a necessity. It's also the fact that we didn't have the ease of transportation that we have in the 21st century. There was one horse for every about 10 people around here 200 years ago. And so one of the things that doctors almost always had was a horse and buggy, or horse and a shay, which is a two-wheeled horse-drawn vehicle that the doctor in the last scene was driving. And so the doctor, came to the patient most of the time. Most doctors charge per visit, depending how far they had to travel, how long they stayed, and how much medicine they gave you to give to the patient. So doctors could make 2 or 3 house calls or more a day, because it was a very cash poor society. Most business, including doctors' business, was done on a debit credit system where people wrote down what was owed, and fortunately, doctors, being educated people, kept good records, and many of their records have survived, including many doctors' accounts in our research library here at Old Sturbridge Village. Anyway, looking at some of those is how I got some of these statistics, and usually a doctor's visit would be charged half a dollar to $1 or more per visit. When you consider that A woman working in one of the 3 textile factories that were in the historic Sturbridge in the 1830s was making $2 a week. When you consider that a man working a skilled trade like a blacksmith was making $1 to $1.25 a day, 50 cents to $1 per visit is pretty lucrative. Doctors then, like doctors now, tend to make more than the average person. And doctors at the time were an elevating, a growing, and an increasingly self-conscious profession. And I think that idea of self-consciousness is part of what defines a profession. And so I think they were increasingly viewed by others and viewed themselves as prosperous. This is Dr. Jesse Kitteridge Smith of Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, painting that we have in our collection here. And you can see his house and his shay parked outside. Some of the tools of his profession, knives, scalpels, a tooth key, various medicines, including whatever medicine he has in his hand there as part of his profession. Also that gold watch chain and the jeweled stick pin on his chest there, all speak to his prosperity. But also seen as professionals. This self-portrait by Dr. Metcalf Marsh, and respected. They're very often seen as necessary and members of the community and leaders of the community, as physicians continue to be in the 21st century. And increasingly in the 19th century is educated. Most doctors 200 years ago were not college graduates. Most doctors then learned through apprenticeship, the traditional way that people learned other trades. But increasingly, younger men felt the need to at least get a general bachelor's degree before studying medicine, to be seen as more educated than the average person. Again, no germ theory at the time, so they followed practical medicine. And mostly that was trying to balance the 4 humors, often in a very dramatic fashion. And again, even today, if we ask the doctor, help, do something, people expect it. If they're not feeling well, a loved one is not feeling well, somebody might die, we're desperate for help, and people do what they can then and now. As I said, you try to balance the 4 humors. So giving enemas, like this young lady here on the left with her maid helping out, and the dirty man peering around the curtain. The doctor here on the right giving his patient something to make him vomit, again, to balance the humors, or to get somebody to sweat. Sometimes cupping was done, pacing, but this is still used in Asian medicine, placing hot glass containers on the skin, which as they cool, create a vacuum and draw blood and interstitial fluid to the surface. And very often those blisters would then be pierced with this tool on the left called a scarificator to remove the humors, the fluids that were out of balance in the body. And so each doctor was his own pharmacist, so he would concoct medicines. He might buy some from urban apothecaries, but also would concoct his own medicines and distribute them to the patients. And sometimes, go into swamps or have somebody go into swamps and get leeches for treatment. Leeches and for that matter, maggots are increasingly used in modern medicine, sometimes to debride necrotic tissue. In other words, remove dead tissue to encourage healing. Nowadays, they're lab-grown sterile leeches. They're not going in swamps to get them. But there's no Food and Drug Act until the early 20th century, and so there's no regulation. So it pretty much everything goes. I mean, you've got cannabinoids being prescribed, and cocaine and opium. Coca-Cola was called Coca-Cola because early on cocaine was in the formula. When the Pure Food and Drug Act came along, they had to replace it with caffeine. But all kind of thing was cigarettes for asthma. Yeah, that makes sense. Anyway, the soothing syrup for children, that often had opium in it, sure helped teething pain. Yep. Anyway, um, they did do surgery. If they opened the thoracic or cavity, if they opened the core of your body, infection was going to kill you. They knew that most of the time. But very often, to keep an infection from going systemic, they resorted to amputations for serious injuries, including compound fractures where the bone sticks through the skin. But they didn't have anesthesia or antiseptic techniques, so the doctor, with any hope of a cure, had to work fast. You had several people to hold the patient down, and then you had a minute or two to perform the surgery, and to get the wound closed up, including tying off tissues, cutting through the bone, and sewing everything back together. I can't even imagine. And so your orthodox physicians, the one that most people recognize as doctors, tried to follow this allopathic course of medicine. The British example of having separate surgeons and separate physicians was not followed here because of the sort of delegitimization of British society following American independence. Even today, in Britain, surgeons are called Mr., not Doctor. But anyway, as I was saying, doctors usually learned by doing through apprenticeship, like you'd learn other trades. And there was an effort to keep governments from licensing doctors. Massachusetts tried it for a while, and the doctors were able to beat it back for many years. The reason behind that is, again, because there's no one modern school of medicine at the time. There's different theories, but you don't want to be one of the doctors whose theory is discredited by some government. And so that's why the medical profession for a long time fought against licensing. They didn't want non-doctors saying who's a doctor. And so they formed medical associations to try to keep that under doctors' control. But medical schools were formed, some with colleges. Harvard was the third after the Perelmans in Philadelphia and Columbia in New York City. And I got a few other on the screen. Anyway, a lot of the tools, this thing on the right looks like a trumpet, is actually a stethoscope. If you ever watch the television British series on PBS that's called Call the Midwife, they're using tin versions of this monaural stethoscope, one-eared stethoscope, to listen to for fetal sounds. On that show called The Midwife, which is set in the 1950s and 60s, so it's not in that ancient past. And you also see the doctor in that show using the forceps, the obstetrical forceps on the left there, to extract babies during difficult births. Anyway, I did some look into the doctors that were actually practicing in the historic town of Sturbridge, Massachusetts in the 1830s, and there were 5 or 6, and these are their names. We're not going to go through them all, except that you'll notice they have some of them have initials after their letters. Now, today, MMS is a Master of Medical Science. It's a degree that some physician assistants hold, but what it means here is a Massachusetts Medical Society. And you've got a couple of them that are calling themselves medical doctors. So what these letters mean is usually a generational shift. The MDs are usually people that have gone to college, or at least feel themselves as more educated, so they start using that medical doctor after their name. And the older generation of the people born in the 18th century are more likely to be members of the Massachusetts Medical Society. And so very often those letters signify a generational shift. So in the real Sturbridge of the 1830s, it was about 1 doctor for every 400 to 500 people. As you can see, we've got about that ratio of doctors to people today, maybe a little better, but most doctors today are either not practicing or they're specialists. So for primary care physicians, it's like 1 doctor for every 1,550 people. So people 200 years ago might not have had doctors that were as good as ours today, but they had a lot more of them. So he talked about anatomy and dissection and how they learned. Um, there were more advanced medical training. If you really wanted the best at the time, certainly not by modern standards, you went to Europe, especially Germany and Scotland, where they were a little more scientific in their medical practice. In the second half of the 1800s is when modern medicine really gets its foothold. You start to have scientific research going on. You start to have an acceptance of germ theory and the discovery of bacteria. Um, two New England dentists, Horace Wells and William Morton, popularized the use of anesthesia. Wells with ether, and Morton with I got that backwards. Morton with ether, and Wells with laughing gas with nitrous oxide, which were used in general surgery as well as dental surgery for quite some time. Again, just being personal, when I had my tonsils out in the 3rd grade, I was anesthetized with ether. Anyway, and a lot of advances in modern medicine are more public health, just having cleaner water and better sanitation, better sewerage, and better living conditions, eliminating rodents and the fleas they carry have done an awful lot for public health, and just people having better nutrition, including vegetables, which people knew made you healthier. But in the 20th century, they figure out vitamins and are able to supplement that and cure a lot of diseases like rickets by making sure kids get vitamin D, and scurvy by making sure people get vitamin C through fresh fruits and vegetables. But there are a lot of what we call quack medicine. This is another cartoon from the comic magazine of the 1830s. Scraps of quacks practicing hydrotherapy. The water cure was a big fad in the 19th century, using hot water, steam, cold water baths, hot water baths, steam baths to try to cure various and sundry ailments, including not only those baths, but visiting mineral springs, bathing in mineral water, drinking mineral water. Electric medicine was a big fad at the time. If you looked in 19th century city directories, oftentimes you'd find electricians who were not wiring your house. They were really doctors, like Dr. Thomas Gale, who treated illnesses with electricity, at first static electricity, and then as they figure out you can generate it with batteries and with magnets, I should say, direct current electricity. And Thomas Gale, who built and sold this medical apparatus from our collection that was used by a doctor in Dudley, Massachusetts. Thomas Gale wrote a book called Electricity or Ethereal Fire, in which he basically said how you could treat anything except cataracts with electricity. And he spent 2 pages telling you how he tried to treat cataracts with electricity and why it didn't work. But everything else you could treat. There were also empiricists and herbalists. Samuel Thompson, his wife died, and he blamed the doctors who bled her and puked her and purged her. And so he studied herbal medicine, probably from indigenous people, wrote a book on it. And for $20, you could have his book and his license that made you a Thompsonian physician. There was also homeopathy, the idea that you treat like with like, but in remarkably tiny doses, teeny itty bitty bitties, like, a molecule of something that would give you a fever. If you got a fever, give that to them, it'll cure it. Kind of the theory of immunization today. You also had people like Sylvester Graham, who was a temperance lecturer, who also told people to eat a vegetarian diet, and that would be better for them, and they'd be healthy and live a long life. He died at 57. Enough said there. There are also people that were practicing other medical specialties. Dentists, some physicians also did dentistry as part of their practice, but some people just practiced dentistry. They were not considered doctors yet. They hadn't really professionalized. It was more of a trade. Of course, George Washington, these pictures on the left are George Washington's dentures. He had several pairs. And sometimes I have the privilege of portraying this dentist, Sabre Gustin Jr., whose broadside we have in our library collection. This is a painting at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston of a family from Ware, Massachusetts, Joseph Moore and his family. Moore made hats in the wintertime, and then in the summertime, he'd travel around and be a dentist. And there were also people that did bone setting and midwives that helped with delivery and various and sundry other medical problems. And of course, a number of indigenous people, men and women, would often practice their traditional medicines, and very often Euro-Americans would resort to indigenous healers. We have the accounts of Homer Merriam, who's a printer from West Brookfield, Massachusetts, who had chronic digestive problems until he went and sought out and lived with for several months indigenous woman named Rhoda Rhodes, who basically cured him of his digestive problems by putting him on her diet and giving her herbs, and whatever was wrong with him, it fixed him. Anyway, but basically, they gave labels to diseases, but it was all a matter of what the signs and symptoms were. They weren't able to do. I mentioned that Horace Wells of Hartford and William Morton, who actually trained to be a dentist in Hartford with Wells, who was from Charlton, Massachusetts, popularized laughing gas and ether as anesthesia. In fact, if you go to Hartford, there's a statue to Horace Wells, and there's also one in Paris as the father of anesthesia. And if you go to Cambridge or Charlton, there's memorials to Morton as the father of anesthesia. So there we are. Anyway, back then, these are the 5 leading causes of death. Infectious diseases of infancy, tuberculosis was number 2. Acute infectious diseases like cholera and typhoid, work accidents, and then other infectious diseases related to childbirth were the biggest causes of death. If you look at causes of death today, the closest we have today that I trust is 2021. You notice number 4 is still the same: accidental death through accidents. But other things that really were much farther down the list 200 years ago are now much higher, elevated. COVID pushed suicide down to number 11, by the way. Suicide had been number 10 for a long time. Anyhow, we're almost to 7 o'clock, so I just want to mention that there were a lot of things that could hurt people. And I'm just going to flip through this. I was going to talk about all the things that really we don't worry about in America very much anymore, like smallpox, which the World Health Organization eradicated worldwide by 1980, and things that we get vaccinated for, like diphtheria and measles and tetanus and various other things, mumps and pertussis and influenza, chickenpox and shingles. And polio, things that through vaccination we've largely eliminated in America, or can cure with antibiotics or through better sanitation. Although with antibiotic resistance, by overuse of antibiotics, and by people not vaccinating their children or getting their own vaccines up to date, a lot of things are making a big comeback in America, and we need to be concerned about this, in my humble opinion. But anyway, we've come a long way since 1830, a long way from Hippocrates even. And today we have a lot of things to help us. We live longer, healthier, fuller, and arguably happier and less painful lives. But nobody gets out alive. So anyway, thank you for your patience, and stay healthy.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much for that very interesting history about medicine. I loved the ending bit.
Well, that's the ending we all get, Brittany. Sorry.
That is true. You are right. So I have a few questions for you from our audience. Tom Morehouse actually has a comment. He's mentioning a woman named Mary Jane Seacole. Are you familiar with her at all?
I'm afraid I'm not, Tom. Sorry.
All right. So she was a Black woman born in Jamaica who served to help the ill and wounded in the Crimean War. And she apparently volunteered to help nurse Florence Nightingale when she fell ill. But Nightingale had refused her care because she was a Black woman. So that is very interesting. Thank you
That
for
is interesting. Thank you, Tom. God bless Tom. Tom volunteers here at the village for everybody else that doesn't know, and he's been a leading advocate for trying to do a more inclusive history at the history through at the village. So thank you, Tom, for that and for letting me know. I was not aware of her.
Yes, thank you. We actually have a kind of not really related question, but kind of in the same vein. And you did mention it a little bit. Were there Native American remedies that were in wider use in this time period?
Yeah, if you read the newspapers advertisements at the time, usually you'll find one or two in most editions of many papers for some kind of Indian doctor, to use their words, that or doctress or doctor. A lot of times they would also use the symbol of an indigenous person as a sort of a promotion of a particular medicine. So yeah, and I mentioned Homer Miriam turning to Rhoda Rhodes looking for a cure, and describing, how she basically had this little house, much like our small house at Old Sturbridge Village, and that she basically hung sheets in the attic and had the various people that she was treating for various diseases sleep up there on cots. In the attic with sheets between them. So yeah, people did turn to indigenous people for healing, because if normal medicine didn't help then as now, you turn to what you're hoping is going to cure you, would be it, herbs, crystals,
Mm,
what have you.
right. A question kind of similar to that. When did licensing for MD occur here in the US? And was this the main cause for the decline of naturopaths and homeopaths in the US as well?
Well, I think that a lot of the declines of homeopathy was more with scientific research that showed that it wasn't effective.
Mm,
But licensing has come in fits and spurts. Massachusetts tried it from 1819 to I think 1835, and then went away. Licensing is still done at the state level, so it really comes in fits and starts depending where you are and when you are.
mm.
Um, but by the late 19th, 20th century, the medical establishment is both self-regulating, and they're able to have enough political influence to accept the intervention of governments.
Awesome. Were inoculations to disease being used at the time? And if so, were they effective?
That's a great question. For some, smallpox, in 1721, there was a smallpox outbreak in Boston, and the Puritan minister Cotton Mather had an enslaved woman from West Africa in his household, and she basically told Cotton Mather how in West Africa they would inoculate people against smallpox, and people, got sick, but they didn't die, by basically in short form, taking pus from the eruptions, the pox that occurred on the skin from somebody who was infected, and getting some of that pus on a bit of thread, making a cut in a healthy person's skin, and then squeezing that cut up and then dragging the thread through it to basically give people a small dose of smallpox. A few people died from that, but most people would get a mild case and not die, and then have lifelong immunity. In the late 18th century, in 1796, I think, an Englishman named William Jenner, noticed that milkmaids seemed to never get smallpox, because they would come down with a very mild, similar disease called cowpox that was almost never fatal. Um, and that gave him immunity to smallpox. So he started inoculating people not with live smallpox virus, but with cowpox virus, which would give you immunity against smallpox. And so with that, I mean, that smallpox had been the biggest killer of people on the planet for a long time. And by 1949, it was gone from the United States. And in 1980, the World Health Organization said it's gone from the world. Supposedly there's some of the virus in a vault in Georgia and some in a vault in Russia. And hopefully those stay in the vault.
Let's hope so. It's a weird thing to keep in a vault, but okay.
Well, I mean, I guess scientists don't want, they want to know what the virus is in case heaven
Yeah.
knows they need to study it. So
Yep.
that's beyond my expertise.
That's interesting. In your research, who do you feel was the father of modern medicine and why?
Oh gosh, I don't know. There's so many. There's so many candidates. William Lister and antiseptic and aseptic technique in surgery. And um, and since more women are becoming doctors than men now, who knows what is going to come down the pike? I don't know. I don't have one candidate. I think it's definitely an ensemble.
Yeah, a group
Yeah,
effort.
yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Were doctor barbers from the 1800s, or were they
Yeah,
infant?
that's more of a medieval thing. The barber surgeon
Mm,
was more of a medieval thing that would, shave you and bleed you and do other things. No, that's pretty much largely gone by the 19th century. The physicians um like lawyers and like ministers were a small enough, tight enough group that they were actually promoting themselves as an exclusive profession. And part of a profession is also being self-regulating,
mm,
having journals, having organizations. Dentists were getting into that. By 1839, 1840, the dentists were starting to professionalize. They wanted more respect. They formed a college of dental surgery in Baltimore. They started issuing journals. They had an organization, and so you got so many professions now that are following that route. Nurses certainly, as well as architects and hundreds and hundreds of other people that go through a certain regimen of education and oftentimes a licensing procedure or an internal licensing procedure like passing the bar
mm.
for the lawyers. So
Interesting.
anyway,
So Sarah wants to say it's a wonderful talk,
oh,
and
thank
she
you.
would love to know if you have any recommendations for books on medicine in 19th century New England.
Oh golly, there's so blessed many. I can't think of just one. No, there's so many. I'm sorry. Um,
Sarah, if you want to email the collections and research team, we can maybe send you a few.
oh yeah, I'll put some together. Yeah, that's a great place. Yeah. I mean, one thing top of my head, real short. I mean, Old Sturbridge Village 50 years ago put together a whole pamphlet series. Good things. They're like 40, 50 pages long, and one of them is on early medicine. It's a good place to start.
Given the affluence of 19th century physicians or the profitability of medical practice, were there many physicians who also had a second career, whether farming or something else?
That's a very good question. Affluence is relative compared to lawyers. Physicians were not as affluent by a long shot in the early 19th century. But yeah, some as I mentioned in colonial times, a lot of ministers were also physicians. Some physicians also farmed. Some people got out of medical practice. Some physicians got out of general practice and specialized. I can think of a guy, I think his name was William Blood from Worcester, who got out of being a physician and just practiced dentistry because he, for whatever reason, whether it was financial or otherwise. There was another one whose name escapes me, who was a physician in the 1700s in Leicester, Massachusetts, but he also was a wood turner, made a lot of spinning wheels and things like that. His name is escaping me, but he was a doctor from Leicester, Massachusetts, who also did a lot of wood turning and made spinning wheels and such. We have his accounts at the research library at Old Sturbridge Village. But his name is escaping me. I apologize.
It's all good. That's interesting though. Maybe like that was his hobby or something.
No, he was quite profitable. I haven't really done an analysis of it, but I think he's making as much or more money from woodworking as he did from being a doctor.
Oh wow, that's
But
really
I
fascinating.
could be misspeaking, but I do remember it wasn't just a hobby; it was a business.
Very cool. I think this will be our last question. Are
Okay.
there any records, diaries, etc., of people's reactions to changes in medicine during the early 1800s?
Well, I one of the deficiencies in my own historian profession is that working in Old Sturbridge Village, I usually don't go much past 1840. And medicine really didn't get into the big changes until the second half of the 19th century into the 20th century. That's when the big changes happened. So the changes in the early 19th century are not, to my mind, that dramatic. But I'll answer that with one final thought about the early 19th century, who goes back into that idea of a physician with a hobby as a wood turner. There was a French doctor in the early 1800s, Dr. René Laennec, and then as now, doctors would try to listen to your heart sounds and your lung sounds. And the way to do it then was to put your ear, if you were the doctor, on the patient's chest. Well, Dr. Laennec over in Paris had a patient who was a very heavy young lady who was not very clean, was not very well bathed. And he didn't really want to put his ear on this very corpulent young lady's chest for a lot of reasons. So he had a magazine with him. He rolled it up into a tube and held the tube to her chest and the other end to his ear. And to his surprise, he could hear her heart so much better than if he'd actually put her ear on her chest. And didn't have light bulbs then, but if they had one would have went off over his head. And he was an amateur wood turner. He went home and made one of those monaural, looks like a little trumpet stethoscopes, and started using that. And then, his physician friend said, "Hey, Renee, can you make me one of them?" And so he did, and made a number of them. And like I said, those in tin were being used into the 20th century in Great Britain. And when I was in Romania 20 years ago, they were still using those kind of stethoscopes, but they were making them out of plastic.
Yeah.
But the monaural, not the
Bigger
the ones we use in the 21st century.
It's funny how things just occur by happenstance,
Yeah, well, and also that whole "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for your great questions, and for Tom for sharing all of his knowledge with us. If you didn't catch the entire program or you would like to share it, a recording of the webinar will be sent to our members in the following week, and it will also be uploaded on the Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page. And thank you again to everyone. I hope you all have a great evening.
thank you, everybody. Good night.
Night.